Hi everybody, and welcome to Lake Nixon, and happy Juneteenth to you today. We want to welcome everybody who's here in the flesh, of course, but we also, and in particular, want to welcome all of you who are joining us online. There are two ways you can access this tonight, one on our church YouTube channel, and also on our church Facebook page, which is 2BC, a different kind of Baptist church. So look us up and participate with us in those ways. We want tonight to be an interactive discussion. And so if you have a question or a comment, feel free to ask that question in the comments. And we'll pick those up later, hopefully. We'll pick up the good ones and play with those a little bit and engage our panelists and learn and grow a little more. It is Juneteenth. I was very much a grown man before I knew anything about Juneteenth. And that's a shame because this is a holiday in the most literal sense of that word. It is a holy day. This is the day that we remember where news of emancipation made it to Galveston, Texas, to people who had been enslaved. And it reached them on June 19th, 1865. What's interesting about that is that they were formally and legally emancipated 2.5 years earlier, on January 1st, 1863. But there is a mysterious interim of when a thing was made legal and when a thing was made real. We gather today on Juneteenth, and I hope that you'll keep that in mind. I also want to welcome you to Lake Nixon. I hope you can see some of the views. By the way, Lake Nixon is open if you want to get out and fish or boat or have a good time on a hot summer day. The camp is open to you and your family. Just look us up online. You can call Andy Black, and we would love for this to be a blessing to you and your family in these days. Second Baptist purchased Lake Nixon in 1968.
Wow.
And it is because two African-American teenage girls were in the process of suing Lake Nixon, which up to that point had been a private club and day camp and totally segregated. As that litigation began to make its way up the court system, the owner wanted to sell cheap, and Second Baptist bought it and immediately integrated it. What I think about, though, is that all of that went down in 1968, but the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were 3-4 years earlier, 5 years earlier. What happened legally and formally, and yet when it happened in reality for people, and a mysterious and long interim. This day and this place remind us that the things we espouse legally, the things that we aspire to as a country and as Christian people, aren't always the way it happens in real life for folks. So today we're inviting you into interim space and a liminal space, and to guide us through this chasm of what we say about ourselves and what we think about ourselves and what we believe about ourselves and who we really are. Into that vast chasm, we've invited some panelists to join us. Each of these people that are going to speak today have ministered to me in one way or another, in ways that I'm profoundly grateful for. I've appreciated their work from afar and found great encouragement in it, as I know you will today. I want to introduce you to the panelists. To my immediate left is Antoine Phillips. Antoine is an attorney at Wright, Lindsay & Jennings, which, by the way, they're doing some really neat work with Philander Smith these days and the Social Justice Institute. So if you haven't seen that, you should look that up. Antoine is a community leader. He is currently running for a city board position. And he has been a tremendous friend of mine. I think the world of Antoine. He also is responsible for the second best podcast in Central Arkansas. So look up Rock the Culture, but before you do that, look up Because It Is, which is our church podcast. Behind us, they do a really good job.
He's not going to tell you that Rock the Culture was the inspiration for the church podcast.
There is some truth to that. That is right. That is correct. Ferranda Brassfield is joining us today. I've appreciated her work from afar. Ferranda is an attorney here in Little Rock. And she also is the director of Abolish the Death Penalty work in Arkansas.
Arkansas Coalition
to abolish the death penalty. Thank you. When I found out about her organization and began to read about it, that's really what prompted a lot of study on my part about the death penalty and what has gone down in the state of Arkansas in the last 5 years in terms of the death penalty. She is doing incredibly important work, and tonight we're going to talk specifically about the death penalty. And so, Ferranda, we welcome you to this place.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, glad you're here. And Judge Marion Humphrey. Judge Humphrey is a retired circuit court judge. How long were you a circuit court judge?
18 years circuit.
18 years.
4 years district court, what was then called municipal court, so long ago.
We're not talking about your age tonight. But
I'll bring it up.
Judge Humphrey is also the pastor of Allison Memorial Presbyterian Church. I preached there a few years ago at a gathering, and my knees trembled because I kept thinking, this is Judge Humphrey's pulpit, and I never could quite feel like I was worthy to be there. He is a leader in our community and has been a strong voice for justice for decades, someone I look up to, and so Judge Humphrey, welcome to you tonight as well.
Thank you for the invitation, too.
Just so y'all know who we are, at Second Baptist we say we're a different kind of Baptist church, and we mean that. Like really different. Startlingly different. We're the kind of church that wants to talk about public issues. We think justice has a public dimension to it, and that the Christian faith isn't just private. And we have a long history of work in the direction of racial justice that we're trying to increase in these days. For the last 2 or 3 years, we've specifically talked about racial justice and tried to host communal conversations in that regard. And so what I want each of you to know is that this is a safe place tonight, and we invited you here to speak your truth. And so feel that freedom here. We welcome you, and we're glad that you're here. To all of you who are listening in the flesh or online, what I would ask of you is, even as this is a safe place, it is more so for us white folks, brave space. And what I mean by that is, if you hear something tonight that makes you uncomfortable, and you will hear something tonight that makes you uncomfortable, do not retreat to some ideological trench. Explore your discomfort. Probe your discomfort. Ask not what your discomfort says about what was said. Ask what your discomfort says about you. Because so long as we white folks center our comfort, black folks will not get the justice that is necessary in our day. And so make friends with your discomfort. From the beginning, make friends with your discomfort. That is okay. Most of the time when I'm uncomfortable, it's because God's doing something deep in me. So invite that tonight. Welcome that into your spirit tonight. We're going to talk about several things, and I really want it to be an organic conversation. One other precursor before we dig in with our panelists, and I'll be quiet. One of the things I've learned as a white minister of a predominantly and historically white church is that when you say the word racism, a lot of white people do not understand what that word means. And so the conversation ends before it begins. For most of my life, when I heard the word racism, I thought it was vile people doing vile and evil things with intention. And that certainly has happened, and it is certainly happening. But racism is much bigger than that. Racism can also be the way systems are arranged to benefit some and to oppress and exploit others. When we're talking about systemic racism, we're not talking about what one bad person does. When we talk about systemic racism, we have to train ourselves to think systemically. So work with that with me tonight. Train yourself with me in that regard tonight. To perpetuate systemic racism, we don't need evil people to do something. To perpetuate systemic racism, all we have to do is nothing. And the system does what the system does. To oppose systemic racism, we have to be as intentional about addressing it as we were about constructing it. And so that's what I invite you into tonight, to think systemically with us tonight. We're not talking about any one person. So, as we talk about systemic racism, a question for you panelists, and you can jump in however you desire.
All right.
Where do you see systemic racism most acutely? You can talk about your particular fields, or you can talk about what is just most plain as day to you. Where do you see systemic racism at work today?
Who wanna go? I'll defer to either the judge or to Ferranda.
Y'all are on it.
Well, I'll go first just because I'm closer to you.
Okay.
Two things come to mind, and obviously this is a big topic, and you can probably point to multiple things, but things that happened just recently, that's been in the news, will give you examples of how the system perpetuates racism. When you think about what happened in New York at Central Park with Amy Cooper, and just the idea that she thought that she had the authority to call the police on someone for questioning her. Just the idea in her mind that I'm sure she's a fine person, but in her mind at that moment, there was a black guy, I'm a white person, I get to use the police. And that's the way the system works. And that was her first reaction, was to use the system to her advantage and to someone else's disadvantage intentionally. And she, in her mind, she knew if I call the police and say a black guy is harassing me, certain things will happen. She knew how the system worked to allow her to take advantage to someone else's disadvantage. And I got a phone call from one of my roommates in college. I went to college in Maine, so my roommate was white, which you probably would think, because I went to Maine. But him and I are very close, and we call and we talk all the time, so it wasn't just like a random thing. But the systemic racism in that case it's a power play. I think she wanted to assert that I have advantages that you don't, and you need to recognize it. And she doesn't probably think that every day, but her first reaction in that moment was, there is a system that benefits me, and I'm using it to my advantage. That's a very recent example of systemic racism. Another recent example, I talk so loud usually that I don't need to do this, but another recent example, Preston and I were talking about before we got started. On Monday, there was a committee hearing at the Arkansas State Capitol. And apparently there was an investigation related to the protests at the state capitol. And there were different sides of the story as it relates to what the state capitol police said as opposed to the Little Rock Police Department. But what really stood out to me at the heart of that was a lot of the legislators kept asking the police captains, why didn't you use force to protect the Capitol? Why aren't you harming people to protect the property? Irrespective of the fact that the Little Rock Police Department policy and mission statement literally says we will not use deadly force to protect property. But put that to the side. But just the idea that there were certain type of people out there and they were doing things in their life, those people were less valuable than the property. I expect you to hurt them for hurting property. If it was a different crowd or a different issue, you probably don't have that investigation. You probably don't have that conversation. So that's another example of systemic racism just in the last week, in the last month, that's been in the news. So those are two things come to mind for me.
Can you guys hear me pretty good through my mask and all that? Part of
just to piggyback on what Antoine said, the whole Amy Cooper situation, I've seen plenty of those videos. I'm not so sure she's a fine person.
I was giving her the benefit of the doubt.
But, you know, I'm a part of a racial disparities in the Arkansas criminal justice system steering committee, and it's housed at UALR, and it's a group of individuals and organizations together that came together to study the racial disparity in the Arkansas criminal justice system. And what we found is that African Americans are disproportionately treated at every step of our criminal justice system here in the state of Arkansas. From arrest to charge to sentencing, African Americans are treated disproportionately more harsh than their white counterparts. And it culminates with the death penalty, where we found that African Americans are over 2 times more likely to receive the death penalty versus their white counterparts. And you've got 2 people that are charged with capital murder. The African American person is over 2 times more likely to be sentenced to die versus their white counterpart that has been convicted of the exact same crime. And so in the state of Arkansas and in this country, being African American could mean life or death. And the death penalty is like the culmination of all of these injustices. But we see that with bail fees and fines. We see systemically people are, and this is all people are deprived of their liberty based upon an accusation or a charge. And the way that our system works, you are tasked with proving that you did not commit this crime before you can get out of jail a lot of times. They will set a bail for you. That's not the way that the law is written, that bail is an automatic thing, but that's the way that our courts are working right now. So we found ourselves in the middle of 2 pandemics and COVID-19, and then we've got this unjust system that we have got to do something with. We've got to totally revamp the way that we are doing corrections. As you see, we've got a racial disparity in COVID-19. The African Americans are, the health disparities are alarming, and even with this new disease, African Americans are dying at much higher rates than other people. So systemically in healthcare and criminal justice system, there's racism there.
There are a lot of instances where we can pretty much determine that racism is systemic and it's system-wide in all respects and all facets of life in our country. When I was growing up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, in 1970, the schools entered a unitary desegregation plan. That meant that the all-black schools, such as the schools that I had attended, no longer could exist as such. All the schools were supposed to be desegregated. And Pine Bluff High then was an institution where up until that time, maybe a few had been able to be admitted to Pine Bluff High, a few African Americans, but it was by and large 99% white at the time. And when the schools were desegregated, there had been 2 African American high schools in the Pine Bluff district. And they had principals who had been in place for a long period of time, and they were certified through the certification process with the State Board of Education. Both of those principals were ignored and passed over to become principal of Pine Bluff High School. Instead, an elementary school white principal was chosen to become the principal of a secondary school. And one of the African American principals became principal of a junior high school, and the other became an assistant to the white man who became principal at Pine Bluff High. So that even when desegregation occurred, it wasn't done fairly. It wasn't done in a way that was just and fair to all the people who were concerned. A lot of African American teachers that I knew at the time retired, even those who didn't tell their ages previously, told their ages so they could get their retirement and not be bothered with the new system that they would have been compelled to enter in Pine Bluff. That's the kind of, it's not just something that's occurred on that one instance. I think in a whole lot of places, in a whole lot of school districts, particularly throughout the South, when schools were desegregated, that transpired, that phenomenon. And so I think that we get a sense from that even when there's this order for all the schools to operate in a way that's non-discriminatory, people find a way to discriminate. And that's indicative of the kind of systemic racism that exists. Antoine was speaking about a situation before the legislature this past week involving our chief of police being questioned about what some legislators, most of them outside of our area, were referring to riots and disorder that occurred at the time of the protests over the last few weeks. And there were state troopers who were out there on the grounds in Little Rock. I didn't see the head of the state police called over to the legislature to answer for that. And the chief of the state capitol grounds so much as said that he never called our chief of police, who was African American, to try to coordinate strategies or even to share intelligence information, because he had seen our police chief along with our African American mayor in Little Rock actually out joining with some of the protesters in marching, and I guess he didn't consider them trustworthy enough to share information. Rather, he was calling a white captain, someone under the chief of police, and discussing with him how you're going to go forward in maintaining public order. That to me is symptomatic of the way some people feel, even when you have an African American who is in the head position. Ostensibly, people feel that they can circumvent dealing with him and go deal with some other white person who is not in the position that African American happens to be in. And I just think this is the perception of either competence or whatever you want to call it, competence, or just the notion that the African American person shouldn't be there in the first place. And from there, it becomes racist at that point. And so I think that's the kind of example that we see recently, kind of examples that I saw all along growing up in segregated Pine Bluff back in the day. And it continues in our society, and it's up to younger people to do something about it.
Really?
So one of the things that we asked our church to do this week was watch Just Mercy, and it's a book that we've read in our church book club. But Brian Stevenson is much more than one book. And one of the things that he's tried to do through the Equal Justice Initiative is show the thread that runs from slavery to how it has evolved into what we see today in mass incarceration. So just a little bit of data. Since 1970, the rate of incarceration in this country has grown 700%. 700% since 1970. And though in this country we have 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's incarcerated people. Mass incarceration does today what slavery in large part did a century and a half ago. In fact, there are more African American men in prison today than were enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War. I can never quite say that statement in a way that makes me believe it, and yet it's true. And so, let's talk for a second about mass incarceration. All of you and your expertise in the justice system. What are the factors that keep mass incarceration mass, and how do we break those cycles?
Well, I was a judge for 22 years, 18 years as a circuit court judge, 4 years as a district court judge, and of course, the district courts deal with misdemeanors, serve as a magistrate court for felony cases, but don't have jurisdiction to try those or adjudicate them. Circuit court is different. And my experience has been that it is the nature of the charges that are pursued by the police, the type of crimes that might lead towards African Americans being pursued, investigated, and charged, convicted, and sentenced. In addition to that, there's the issue of punishment in determining how much punishment is sufficient for the offense. And I think that's where we really get into this issue of mass incarceration, the length of time that people are given for convictions. And particularly when you deal with drug cases. And a class-wide drug case with a range of penalty from 10 to 40 years of life. Many jurisdictions impose very harsh sentences upon African Americans who are convicted of those particular drug offenses. And I think the so-called drug war has fed this mass incarceration. Now, I believe that people should be punished for their offenses, but I believe that it should be proportionate. What is the offense? What is the effect upon people? And when the drug war was begun, it seemed as though people decided that every person who comes in court is responsible for all of the drugs that exist in our country, in our society, and therefore we can throw the book at everybody, rather than dealing with that person from the standpoint of what is the particular offense this person committed, what is his role or her role in drug trafficking, and sentence on that basis. But so often, African Americans are sentenced at the high end, or at least they were in the years, I've been off the bench almost 10 years now, but what I saw over the period of time when I was there, people sentenced at the high end rather than at the low end. And the legislators had a tendency of enacting legislation requiring more and more punishment and harsher sentences for those particular offenses. And to me, it missed the point anyway, because when you start dealing with drugs like cocaine, cocaine's not something that's grown in the United States. So if you really want to do something about the drugs like cocaine, you need to go after the cartel. And we have not done that in this country. We haven't chosen to do that. Rather, they've chosen to go after the people who are standing on street corners. And yes, we do want people removed from street corners. But even with them, we want them to have an opportunity to redeem themselves, to become rehabilitated. As Christians, I think, believe people should. And we want them to have a second chance. We don't want them to spend all their lives in the penitentiary because they sold drugs to someone who chose to go and purchase drugs. That's the other thing about the drug traffic. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but it's supply and demand. People are only selling it because there are people who are buying it. And if there were people who were out purchasing corn or tomatoes and whatever, cucumbers, they would sell that and get the money. But there are people who are actually out looking for drugs. As one young man told me, well, I just needed to medicate my feelings. Here again is a role for the church. There are a lot of people out here who want their feelings medicated. And so many people don't feel they can medicate them with Jesus, as some of us believe that we can medicate our feelings with him and his spirit. But that's a personal issue. It's not just a social issue. That can be personal, and we've got to deal with people as people who are out here searching for something and who feel empty and have a void in their lives, and they need some help, and they need another kind of help other than simply incarcerating them for long periods of time. So I think that we get to deal with these issues from that standpoint. We have an understanding of a need of human beings for something in their lives that's fulfilling. rather than simply incarcerating people who have involved themselves with drug trafficking or drug use. And many of the people who are incarcerated are actually just users, depending upon the amount they had, whether they shared it with friends, or whether the police came in their homes at a particular time and found a certain quantity there. Well, we've got to look at all those matters and not just to deal with quick fixes.
I agree wholeheartedly. When I started doing this work, circa 2015, Arkansas had the fastest growing prison population in the entire world. In the entire world. And Arkansas had the fastest growing prison population in the entire world. Not just the country, but the world. And so we've had a failed war on drugs. Even as a small child, it didn't make any sense to me that you can't find boatloads of cocaine, you can't find plane loads of cocaine, but you can find crack rocks in somebody's pocket. Like, how does that make any sense? It's again, systemic racism. African Americans do not do drugs. The studies show that we don't do drugs more than any other population of people. But we are the ones that are targeted for this. I know someone that's in jail or in prison right now for 156 years for selling cocaine. He was not a kingpin. He didn't have any enormous, he didn't own his house. He just came against the wrong prosecutor. He was the right person to send to the penitentiary for 156 years. Our laws, what else contributes to mass incarceration? We have since changed the way that we do probation and parole and the revocations and how we send people, how we revoke them and send them back to prison. But we have been historically very reactionary in the way that we deal with re-entry and revocations and people that have not done everything that they should have done on their probationary or parole release. We also, retroactivity. Since we've changed our laws, we have not made some of our drug laws retroactive. And so there are individuals that are serving sentences under an old sentencing scheme. And why wouldn't we? If the law has changed, why wouldn't we allow those folks to have some relief? But, the prosecutors' lobby is extremely powerful. They are always there when there's legislation that comes forward about criminal justice, and legislators listen to them and they look to them for what should we do. And so the people have to have a powerful lobby in that same way. The people have to organize and say, hey, this is how we want our community corrections to go. This is how we want the criminal legal system, because it's not a criminal justice system. This is how we want the criminal legal system to go in our state, and we have to demand those changes.
I was trying to look up my Jay-Z quote of the night because you mentioned about changing revocation. And this is not my answer, but this is going off of what Ferranda said. I was thinking about that. When I think about revocation, I think about weed and marijuana, and now it's legal and you can go buy it on Canis. But 5 years ago, if you were selling it, you got some exorbitant amount of time and you're still in jail, even though now we can go get it legally and freely. I'm a big Jay-Z fan, and if you listen to the Second Best podcast, Rock the Culture, you will hear me quote him often. And he said, he had a line that's related to that. He said, take a young guy free to mow some dirt, yet it's legal in Colorado, yet we deny black entrepreneurs free enterprise. That's why it's a black market. That's why it's called the trap. That's why it's called a project, because it's exactly that. So what he's saying there is that there was a way we could have changed our system and made it retroactive where the people who were doing the things that are now legal get the freedom that they deserve, but we don't do that because we were targeting people and it worked, so those people stay in jail. So that's what I thought about when you said that. So I agree with you. I'm gonna start with a story when I talk about mass incarceration and how it hit me on a personal level. I've had multiple family members in jail. I have my older brothers incarcerated now. So it touched me personally. I have to go to jail to see my brother. And I remember when I first started being a lawyer, I work at Radley Jennings and I do mostly what people call corporate defense work. So I'm not in the courtroom defending criminals. But I remember I had a hearing one day, and before my hearing, there was a criminal case. So I just had to sit and wait. And it was a black guy, and he was there for a drug charge, and the prosecutor was going at him because he had quoted some rap lyrics on his Facebook page. And they were using that against him, saying, you definitely did this because look what you say on social media. And the public defender, I forget who it was, but didn't have the competency to know Lil Wayne and the lyrics or the song to really give him that, I think, a more culturally competent defense. And then that fed into the system where this kid, I mean, like Judge Humphrey, if you do something wrong, you got to pay the time. But I think the sentence that this kid ended up getting was exacerbated by the fact that someone used his culture against him to make it worse for the punishment. And I remember sitting there thinking like, am I doing the wrong work? Should I be doing criminal stuff? Because I know what he did. I quote Lil Wayne on my Facebook page, but I'm not selling drugs. And then it made me think about how else can I be effective to this systematic racism and mass incarceration. So I started getting involved in policy and legislation and ultimately running for office. And it makes me think about the things we do that leads us to mass incarceration. We want our city to be safer, so we call for our legislators and our city board members and our mayors. There's crime, we need more police. I want to feel safe, so give me more police. Whether there's more police in your neighborhood or not, you just want more police. And then when we get more police, they go to certain areas and they target certain folks and they look for certain things, and that's how, to Veronda's point, they find the 2 crack rocks in someone's pocket walking down Asher as opposed to something else, because we have encouraged that as a society. We want to be safer, so give us more police. If there's more police, I feel better about myself, even though it's not affecting me anyway, it's affecting someone else in a different part of town. And then we perpetuate that by asking for more to feel safer, and then it's causing more people that look like me and grew up where I grew up, who are in unfortunate circumstances making bad decisions to be in the system. And once you get in the system, as Veronda said, it's hard to get out the system. And I know that personally because my brother's in the system and he's been in jail. I'm 36. He's going to be 50 in 2 months. He's been in jail more than he's been out of jail. He can't get out of it now. So I get it, and that's why, because people are, his circumstances, and people are, the police that we have asked for are patrolling and seeking for people to put in jail.
And another, if I could say one more thing, another thing about mass incarceration is we get mass incarceration because we don't use our good sense. And that's just the bottom line. One of the marijuana, for instance, Black, white, Hispanic, Americans period, have historically self-medicated with marijuana. Is there anybody that would disagree? That people...
I thought you was going to ask who in here has self-medicated with marijuana.
No. This is not to incriminate yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for not.
The pastor said it's a safe space. Not a safe space?
There was no qualification to safe space.
But people have used marijuana, and now that marijuana, we have recognized finally that marijuana has medical value. We've done nothing to change the way that we prosecute marijuana possession crimes. Still, a very small amount of marijuana is a Class D felony. You're subject to 6 years in prison for having a very small, in my opinion, amount of marijuana. And so these are things that we're not using our sense. I mean, who has gone to the jail and said, hey, which one of you guys have these qualifying conditions? How do we sign you up for a medical marijuana card so that we don't have this problem again? We're not doing that, but we're continuously criminalizing people and sending them to prison. another thing is the way that we have responded to crack versus the pill epidemic, the opioid epidemic. You know, when it was black people smoking crack, you know, everybody was a criminal, round them up, take them out of jail, give them 100 years. But now, you know, we recognize that people can be drug addicts, and so we want to get rehab, and we want to look at the things that we can do. And to me, that's systemic racism, and that's just another thing that contributes to mass incarceration in our state and in our country.
So you've heard all the nuts and bolts of how mass incarceration works. I heard a question a few years ago posed to the church that I can't escape. The speaker said, "We as a culture always ask the question when something's wrong, how can it be punished? But the church's question is, how can this be healed?" That's two separate questions, and you get two separate answers. Certainly, when something is done wrong, punishment, correction is part of that, no doubt. But healing a thing is not the same as punishing a thing. And to criminalize behaviors doesn't immediately mean fix, if it means fix at all. It may exacerbate the problem. So when it comes to incarceration, we have a lot of work to do in terms of healing, not just punishing. Fernando, I want to come back to you specifically on this question. Let's talk death penalty. Those of you who watch Just Mercy or have read the book know that really the entire narrative takes place on death row. And Arkansas has been in the news the last several years about the death penalty. I have been outspoken to all of you. I'm convictionally against the death penalty. I think it's wrong because of my faith. I don't think the way of Jesus puts people to death. I don't think you teach people that it's wrong to kill by killing. But let's pretend for a second that I'm not convictionally against the death penalty. But how is it practiced that makes it unjust? What are pragmatic reasons that make the death penalty unjust, in particular in terms of racial justice?
Sure. So I've got a handy dandy. I do have a couple dollars in my purse.
You came ready for church. You brought a fan and your tie.
My offering, yes, sir. I'm only missing a tambourine. So, you know, the death penalty is unfair and arbitrary, and these statistics are, they should be more widely known. A recent study by the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, shows that blacks are over 2 times more likely to receive the death penalty for a charge of capital murder. African Americans constitute 138 of the 198 executions that have taken place in this state since we began to keep records. There is lynching and execution as we know it now are very closely attenuated. That is something, there's just a historical evolution of lynching is what we have right now. African Americans are charged more harshly, that are sentenced more harshly, and we are executing African Americans much more in our country. Now, you asked me pragmatically why it was bad or wrong, but I have to say, because I'm here with the church, that you might not be surprised, but I was surprised when I first started doing this work how supportive that Christians were for the death penalty. And we'll look in the Bible and be like, okay, here, and here, in the Old Testament, and just skip right over the New Testament, you know, and say, hey, well, it says, you know, we can kill them here, and that's all I need to know. So it's been very difficult to reach the faith community because for some reason the faith community has not been a champion on this issue, and many times has stood on the opposite side of the aisle and been in support of the practice of executions, notwithstanding the fact that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was executed, and he was also innocent. But I'm dismayed by the support that the faith community has had for the practice of death penalty, the lack of support that the faith community has had for abolition of the death penalty, and the lack of support for standing up against the racial inequities in the death penalty and the criminal justice system as a whole.
Can I jump in there? And I'm kind of saying this, and Ferranda, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, the cost to keep someone on death row is way more than it would be to just give someone life without parole, because you get all these appeal opportunities, the state has to pay for all these attorneys to keep going to trial after trial after trial.
Sure.
So it actually is not even economically to the state's benefit.
It's not, but my experience is that we will spare no cost to try to kill somebody. 12 states in the federal government have all done cost studies on the death penalty, and every single one of the studies says the same thing. What you said, it costs more to try to kill somebody. North Carolina did a study that showed that it would save the state $11 million a year if they abandoned the death penalty.
One
Imagine
reason
what you can do
for
with an extra 11 million instead of killing folks.
Yes, and what could we do with that type of money, you know?
one reason also for having more African Americans sentenced to death than others might be the person who's in charge of the decision on charging. In Arkansas, the charges are filed on the basis of an information filed by the prosecuting attorney. So it's up to the prosecuting attorney to make that decision as to whether the charged person with capital murder or first-degree murder, or going down the line, second-degree manslaughter or negligent homicide or whatever. And then it's up to the prosecuting attorney to determine whether or not he or she seeks the death penalty. I think sometimes even that is influenced by the status of the victim. That if it is a victim such as Senator Collins up there in Pocahontas, then the prosecutor may seek the death penalty in such a case as that. However, had it been someone else who didn't have the same pedigree or the same station in life, the prosecutor might say, well, I'll just seek life. The prosecuting attorney has enormous power in that charging instrumentality in this state, and I think in other states, in terms of even taking particular matters before a grand jury, if charges are brought by grand juries in those particular states. While I was on the bench, I pronounced the death penalty in 3 cases. And interestingly, from the standpoint of this discussion, 2 of those cases were whites. One was executed quickly. Christina Riggs, a white woman who was charged with killing her 2 children, one 4, one 1 years old. I think it's the victim of and it was at the time of the Susan Smith stuff in South Carolina and other cases such as that. And she was executed because she didn't want to appeal. She didn't want to appeal her case. I ordered her attorney to file a notice of appeal, and he filed a petition in the Arkansas Supreme Court for a writ of prohibition to prohibit me from ordering her to file an appeal in that case. And the Arkansas Supreme Court granted their petition for writ of prohibition and told me I was out of order for ordering an appeal in that case. However, they came back the next year or so in a per curiam and said that in any case where the death penalty is imposed, there's an automatic appeal. There again, I would take that, as an African American, I take that as kind of racist. That the Supreme Court people probably might be listening to this, suggesting that I'm out of order for ruling that no one had given me authority to say that an appeal had to be filed and lodged on a case such as that, when it just makes common sense that you are going to exhaust every possibility before taking a life, and then the next year they did it on their own. But I think they did not want me to be the one to take the lead in suggesting that there should be an appeal. So Christina Riggs was executed. And I believe that her life could have been saved had she offered a different defense as well. In closing, her argument to the jury was based upon what her lawyer said is, you didn't buy the defense of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, go ahead and kill her. I just have not heard a lawyer do that, even though that was the position that he said they had discussed, and that's the one that she wanted. The other two, one is an African American. The Arkansas Supreme Court upheld me in a determination that the attorney under Rule 37 had failed to give the proper representation. And in all fairness to the attorney, I have to admit, and I hope he didn't take it personally, I was just looking for something on that particular case to make that ruling, and even that was something like 4-3 in upholding my decision to determine that the client had been given ineffective assistance of counsel. That was to James Fudge, who's an African American male. The third is presently on death row. His name is Timothy Wayne Kemp. And Timothy Wayne Kemp killed 4 people in a trailer somewhere across the river. And I saw his attorney out in the hall, and without violating the ex parte rules, I said, why don't you ask the prosecutor if they will agree to a life sentence on that, and so we don't have to have all that coming in my courtroom. I don't believe in the death penalty. I really didn't want it in there. Arkansas, by the way, has relieved judges of any discretion in that area. It's a jury. It's a jury matter. Juries impose, we pronounce it, set a date, which generally is not carried out because people appeal, and they appeal forever on those things. And his response to me when I said, you need to ask the prosecuting attorney to see if in this case, a female was handling that case, if she will agree to life without. He said, I already have. Her response to me was, there are too many dead bodies, don't ask me no more. You know, she's a good lawyer, by the way, and a tough prosecutor. That was her response to him. That was his response to me. I've already asked the prosecuting attorney, and she said, too many dead bodies, don't ask me anymore. And he did kill four people. But you have to know that there's something, there's some kind of sociopath here or something going on with people who do certain things. And they're given mental evaluations, but almost invariably they're found competent to proceed, and they're found that they were mentally competent at the time of the commission of the offense. And so legally, you don't have a ruling, you don't have a basis for making a ruling that the person was suffering from mental disease or defect at the time they did what they did, based upon the medical stuff that is submitted from the state mental health department. So, but these are just instances of people who are before juries, but the prosecutors can still determine at any time that instead of seeking the death penalty in a case, even where there's premeditation, capital murder, and it's up to them to go after it or not. And often I think that is determined on the basis of who the victim was in that case.
And in our racial disparity study, we've got the data that shows that African Americans, for all of the offenses that we studied, are charged higher than whites. And they're more likely to, African Americans are more likely to be charged higher and then later have their charge dropped. And that affects bail, that affects, if they're gonna get to go home to their families or not because they're charged higher. On the flip side of that, whites were more likely to be charged lower originally and then have that charge raised at a later time. And so that's another racial disparity, and that's the way that the prosecutor's discretion can affect someone going home and then, the type of plea bargain that you can get because you got this high charge and you're trying to work your way down. So that's another added component.
So we have about 15 more minutes, and my job is to keep us on point. And I have two more questions I want to ask because it can't get dark out here. Chantel's scared of snakes, and so we can't let that happen.
Oh yeah, we need to go.
So 2 questions. What would you like to see churches be loud about in terms of racial justice today? What specific policy proposals would you like to see churches stand up and say, this needs to change?
I defer to the pastor first.
Well, I think the connection to love thy neighbor as thyself, and just to look for concrete instances where that is to be acted out. And I think that will shape people's consciousness about how they look at other people and how they approach them. Really just do to black people as you would have black people do to you, and black people do to white people as you would have do to you. I think that is, I think that years ago, Julian Bond, who was a civil rights leader, activist, once a state senator in Georgia and head of the NAACP, and decidedly from his public pronouncements, not religious. But Julian Bond said what America needs is a white Martin Luther King. Someone who can talk to white people, and white people will listen to. And they may not listen to an African American preacher or somebody else. But Julian Bond said white America needs a white man or woman speaking to white people about justice and making this simple point, I think, about loving thy neighbor as thyself and communicating that neighbor means African Americans as well as white people who live next door to you.
I'd like to see the churches to first stand up so that we can abolish the death penalty. Thou shalt not kill. It's just that simple. So that's the first thing. Another thing, I would like the churches to be more vocal about issues of mental health and substance abuse that are being criminalized. I think that the churches could play a really integral part in changing the law in that regard. Another thing, we've got police brutality, and we're seeing that play out on our world stage now. That's another issue that the church could really be vocal about. There's so many correlations to, the story of Christ, and it's just something that the churches should do now.
I agree with all that. I'll piggyback on the use of force policies that the police departments have. I know in the city of Little Rock, there is momentum to change some things, but the church is everywhere. So it's just not in Little Rock, and those policies need to affect our families, whether they're in Little Rock, Fayetteville, El Dorado. We need those type of uniform policies as we control or mitigate what a police officer can do. Now, we may have some bad police officers who step outside the use of force protocol, but right now there are not. The mayor of Little Rock, Mayor Frank Scott, implemented or is about to implement a ban on chokeholds and neck restraints. But until that's enforced, technically a police officer could do that and be within the bounds of policing, even though that is essentially what happened to George Floyd, causing his death. Another thing I think the church can get behind that's a big issue there's a lack of funding for public defenders. So there's a lot of, and I think there needs to be some lobbying in that regard. A lot of these cases that we're talking about, a lot of these people, and my brother, because I wasn't a lawyer at the time, and even if I'm not the type of lawyer he needs anyway, I'll mess it up for him. But a lot of these people go to court and they were public defenders, and they're over, it's unbelievable how much work they have to do. So it just becomes a system, and Judge, I'm sure you can talk about this, that, I mean, they just got so many cases, so they can't give Joe Blow the attention he would need if he was a private attorney, because they just don't have enough attorneys working public defenders' offices. So if there was a lobby behind raising funding for public defenders so they can hire more lawyers to represent people, maybe we can put a dent into mass incarceration, put a dent into how people are unjustly sentenced. But when you one public defender and you got 100 cases a day, I'm exaggerating a little bit, it's hard to give them the attention they need.
Do you know, since you brought that up, do you know how funding public prosecutors compares to funding public defenders?
I do not do either. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Well, I don't know, but I know it's a lot more for prosecuting than it is for defending. And that's almost a given.
I'm happy to look it up and give it to you.
Yeah, I don't know the statistics. One other thing I would say too is that I think that the church can at least examine how prosecutors handle their office in terms of equity and fairness in filing charges and what kind of charges are filed. Because again, that charging power is great. And I want to give this example of what it means for a prosecutor to use his discretion. When before the change in law, at one time, if you had a certain amount of cocaine, for instance, the mandatory sentence was a minimum of 10 years if you were convicted of possession of cocaine with intent to deliver, and you had an ounce or so. But they make a decision as to who is actually charged with that. And a classic example I had was once a police officer from North Little Rock was charged with theft of property, which was a case, which is a charge by which a person could receive probation. But he was alleged to have stolen the drugs out of the property room at the North Little Rock Police Department.
So instead of being charged with the drug,
he was charged with theft.
yeah.
And with theft, you can get probation. But if he had been charged with the drug charge, there would have been a mandatory sentence of incarceration. Well, I treated it as though he had been charged with drugs. So I
gotta have good judges.
I sentenced him to prison because he had been the one who had arrested so many African American folks over in North Little Rock with drugs. And here he is taking the drugs out of the property room, and you know what's going to happen. They're going to end up back on the streets. If he stole them from the property room, you cannot steal the drugs without possessing the drugs. You gotta possess them to steal them. And so they didn't even charge him with possession of drugs. But I'm not gonna have this ruse come through by me, and I look at this and not give him some prison time. Of course, they probably had put him in some kind of protective custody once he went to the Department of Corrections, but that's all right. But if he had brought people in charged with possession of drugs and they went to prison for it, how in the world could I, in good conscience, not impose him a sentence that would send him, to the penitentiary? He'd still get out in less time than those who had that minimum 10-year sentence would. But nonetheless, at least he got some prison time. And that's the power. That's the power of the charging instrumentality possessed by the prosecutor. The prosecutor had to be clever in not charging him with a drug charge, only charging him with theft.
I'll jump in there real quick, Preston. My last point is related to the movie that we all seen, Just Mercy. That lawyer had resources and time to work that case. The public defender doesn't have that type of time or resources to work that case. So if there was more lawyers, then maybe those type of situations either stop on the front end, where that person is not incarcerated, or you have more of that story. That story is uncommon because most of these public defenders are just swamped. Absolutely.
Let's end with hope.
Yes.
Where do you see hope today? What gives you hope?
What gives me hope today is the renewed attention to these issues that's beyond just black people. So there is some hope there. But when in all these moments, they're fleeting. So you have to strike legislatively, societally, systemically now. I mean, while we're all paying attention to these type of issues, we have to do it now. So if we wait to act, say, okay, well, we're gonna wait till December to do something, it's too late. But I'm hopeful right now. I'm hopeful today because we're paying attention today and we can act tomorrow. I don't want to be hopeful today and like, okay, in 3 months we're gonna do something. We're gonna get it together. We're gonna have another meeting, and then we're gonna come up with a plan. No, we understand what the issues are. People get it. We're paying attention. So I'm hopeful today that if we keep this, we can move forward. So that's my hope.
What gives me hope? Seeing young, old, black, white, brown people in the streets, at the Capitol, on their Facebook, social media, standing up about these issues. What gives me hope is seeing so many communities reimagining how they do corrections. Taking a hard look at, their police department and saying, even what we're doing here in the city of Little Rock, with our independent review board, looking.
Don't shout yourself out a little bit.
Well, yeah, I had to do that. Looking at the police department and saying, where are there opportunities for improvement, like fundamental change and improvement in our criminal legal system. What gives me hope? Confederate statues coming down every
Literally
day.
today. Yeah.
Literally today. Us saying that we're not going to stand for this anymore. This makes no sense, and we're going to do things differently. Those are some of the things that give me hope in a pandemic on top of a pandemic.
Before Judge go, I was giving you a hard time, but Ferranda was recently named to the independent review committee for the city of Little Rock that's doing the independent investigation to the policies and practices of our police department. So that's what she was getting at. So congratulations, and I know there's work to do.
Thank you.
I'll just say ditto to what both of them have said.
It's a Friday night, and it's Juneteenth, and none of these panelists had to be with us tonight, and I think we should tell them thanks for their time and their expertise with us. And I'll end with this. Towards the end of Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson says something that I needed to hear, which is that hopelessness is the opposite of justice. The last few weeks have felt incredibly heavy, and we've seen the worst of humanity. But the church peddles in hope. We don't give up on hope because we don't give up on God. And what I would say to you today, brothers and sisters, wherever you are, is that we must tell the truth that the white church has been complicit in all of this. In what we have done and in what we have not done. In what we've said and in what we have not said. But I also think that the church has what the world needs today. What does communal repentance look like? If the church doesn't know, the world will never know. What does peace look like? And when I say that word, I do not mean quietism. And I do not mean kumbaya. I mean wholeness, where there's justice. If the church doesn't know what that is, the world will never know what that is. What does love look like? Gritty, grimy love that crosses boundaries and that does what's right, come what may. If the church doesn't know what that love looks like. The world will never know. Y'all, we've been studying this for a long time, and I've been studying this for a long time, and I resonate with what Antoine just said. There is a time to listen. Especially for the white church, there is a time to listen. We've been listening. There is also a time to speak. And I want you all to know, pastor to people, that we're on the precipice of a time to speak. We're trying to figure out what that is and how we say it and what we're saying. But we are going to say it. And we're going to say it without reservation and in no uncertain terms. Racial justice is not peripheral to Christianity. It is at the heart of it. And at every level of our justice system, as you've heard tonight, we have redemptive work to do. And it will be hard, and it will be long, and only the people who are in it will stay in it. But we will do it. We will speak, we will show up, and we will do what's right. So help us God. And all God's people said.
Amen.
Peace be with you.
Also
Be
with
in
you.
touch. The Presbyterian knows how to respond down here.